Welcome all together. My name is Kai. I'm doing 1/35th scale German armor on a weekly basis, and today we will continue with the StuG III Ausf.D by Bronco. Last episode I left you guys here with the model more or less well built and painted. In this episode we apply the mud and dust effects to the complete lower part of the chassis, rust the exhaust using oil paints, and I was robbed of the excuse not dealing with the air filter, so that will be 3D printed and fixed as well, along with some other mistakes. Now let's get into it. Let's start with the actual prep work on the lower hull, picking out the details first. That's something I like to do when I start weathering the actual section, just it's easier to pick out what is going on there. That's followed by a pin wash. Of course I use a dark brown and I skipped the application, don't worry. It's only the cleanup that is a little bit different. When I have a plain vast surface, I like to stipple in the excess of the wash, claiming the first space out of this open area and faking a little bit a shadow. And it's likely that this is completely covered with mud in this area, but nevertheless it's part of the process. Last step, picking out the raised details, highlighting them with a brighter version of the base color. This creates a lot of artificial and forced contrast that does not work everywhere on the model. But here in this recessed area that is covered with the road wheels, the tracks, subject to further weathering, it's okay to do this. And what helps me picking out these bolts and rivet heads, that's a good natural hair brush with a fine tip, as well as brand specific thinners together with a wet palette, so I don't ruin the brush and still get the best out of my paints. Into the fun part, mud and dirt. I usually used up until now the products right from the bottle, using either the heavy mud series or stacking splashes on top of each other till I got somewhat like a dirty chassis. That's a simple approach and surely has its place, it works fine. Nevertheless, I would like to progress in my learning curve and start combining these enamel products together with pigments, serving as a texture source and a binder. This is still not the most advanced technique out there, but it's an important step in the learning process, getting more control and more potential out of a certain effect. And for the how to do it, or how I did it in this case, I start with a dark heavy mud series product and stipple it onto the surface. I divided the surface in 3 parts, limited by the shock absorbers, dividing the whole thing into heavily mudded or dusted areas and one that is less affected. The first pigment I selected for the first layer is color-wise halfway fitting to the heavy mud product, and I use the heavy mud product as a glue to stipple in the pigments, creating the first texture without getting too much pigment, and still I don't want the dust too slimy since it's placed in an arid region after all. The border gets blended using enamel odorless thinner, just stippling it in, blending it a little bit, so we get a not so sharp, a soft contrast. That's still not completely blended down, but you get the idea. That's followed by the second layer, that's Tri-Light Soil. That's a heavy mud product I use quite a lot for various different applications, and here I stipple it on the top of the first layer of pigment and heavy mud. I try to leave some space, let the dark mud shining through underneath it. And for now I concentrate only on one of the areas I work on, keeping the mud product fresh and the pigment adhering, since I want this a little bit caked on effect when the binder shines through the pigment and the pigment is not the upmost visible layer. It's more going for the combination of pigment and the heavy mud. Raised details like the shock absorber or this bumper are not covered. I try to sneak the effect around, leaving the front area unaffected for now, preserving all the details. Look guys, I'm all about the evolution of such vehicles, so I want to preserve technical details, not covering them completely up. And that's just how I like to sacrifice a realistic appearance to serve the purpose I have in mind. Having a look at the finally applied heavy matte, that's still something missing in the middle of the vehicle. That's still to clean. There are endless options for now, going with streaking or splashes, and of course I'm not the resource you want to reference to when you build a competition grade scale model, that's no question, but I selected here just some splashes, and this is from the Nature Effect series. That's light dust. We will see it when we do the tracks. The first layer of splashes gets pulled down with an almost dry brush, and the second one gets just applied over it. My thought process behind selecting light dust as a splash product was I don't want to create any more texture. This is an arid region and there's already too much going on. So I keep it a little bit down here on texture, just going for the paint effect. And if I have a blob that is too large, just going in with enamel odorless thinner, splitting it in half or blending it. Same approach was done to the sprocket and idler wheel, and I leave the center unaffected for now so I can do this in the finishing step. Okay, enough of this. For now, I would like to progress further with the tracks. Usually I would just prime them with Mr. Service 1200 followed by a random brown. This time I would like to add buff. You all know washes for tracks, track wash, dark wash, rust wash, whatever. They have one thing in common. They need something bright to contrast on, to create contrast and depth. And this is why I dusted the complete track in a very bright color. That happens to be Tamiya buff, could be something else. And we can immediately see how this creates interesting contrast on these track links, emphasizing the profile inside the track, for example. This will be my new standard approach when dealing with tracks. Until now I just painted them in a darker color, messing around with too little contrast with the washes. I think this is a step in a good direction. Next step, to create this arid environment or the impression of the dust and dirt, I use the same light dust effect to fill the profile of the tracks, creating an first and very subtle dust layer that will be a base for using pigments in the finishing steps next episode. Okay, the whole thing is then dry brushed with black metal followed with aluminum from Vallejo. That's just the paints I have at hand. And yeah, I would like to show that these profiles are a little bit worn down from hard surface. The inside, where the rubber tires are running on, will be a little bit darkened down using engine grime. That's one of the more universal, useful enamel products, at least in my assortment, creating at least a little bit a not so unified look. Once mounted, I think they give a good variety of different color hues. They look well fitting to the road wheels and the rest of the vehicle, but still they are missing some last splashes or something to as a final touch. For now, let's start with weathering the exhaust area. I start with a base layer of chipping from Ammo by Mick. That's another dark brown that will be used quite often. I don't want to have too many different hues on a model, keeping it more simple, easier to look at, I guess. The whole thing is then moistened with enamel odorless thinner. This liquid layer is really important, I think, for dealing with oil paints or blending or not blending them. I apply a few dots with a rust brown and start stippling it in. I do not want to create a unified rust surface here. I want to leave some of the base color shining through, giving with this stippling motion, that's a very uneven distribution, and layering on more and more different hues will give a nice rusty effect without the need of using pigments, for example. If I have excess, I transfer it just to not yet affected surfaces like the sides or the exhaust pipes, and you see the dust and mud effect emerging underneath what I'm doing here. This has to do with the drying time. I want to manage the time I have at hand the best I can, so there is no continuous progress on this one. I'm sorry. Now I use ochre and I use little of it, not as much as I used the rust color, and I continue stippling it in with a damp brush. The brush is damp with enamel odorless thinner, not dripping wet nor completely dry, just enough to get the pigments a little bit floating and adhering to the brush. In general, oil paints are really good to create a textured effect. That's much better than drying this with acrylics, and we do not create even half of the mess on the workbench in comparison to using pigments, for example. That's why I chose it. It's fast, it's easy, it's clean, and it has a lot of potential in case we want to step up our game. And I really would like to learn more about oil paints. That's why you will see me using them more and more when it's appropriate to do so. The result looks not bad at all, but still there's the final dust layer missing, the splashes are missing, and I would like to create in the finishing steps not some exhaust that just solidifies on the dust. That's why we have to revisit this in the final steps of the build. Putting on the tracks was no great problem. The fit is very loose and you surely will not need to protect the axles from paint, for example, or primer. Comparing this to Trumpeter, where I had to drill out the holes to get the wheels on, there's no comparison. And the workable track links are really nice. They stick together, they hold up very well, and yeah, there's some final adjustment necessary, and that's not a big deal. What I would like to deal with next is some mistakes. The fenders are a little bit crooked since there's interference with the air filter. That's due to me assembling the thing as modules. On the other side there's a little bit interference as well. And the kit did not include pipes for the raised air filters. They are just for the shorter version or for the lower version. That is an option in this kit. There you get the pipes. With the raised one you don't get them. Adam Mann and Panzermeister 36 patched me up with some references on how these pipes looked on a StuG. I had no longer an excuse to ignore it, so let's deal with it. I settled on copying the original pipe and extending it a little bit so it would fit on the raised surface. After getting the measurements by measuring the radii and the pipe diameter, I redesigned the whole thing in CAD and went over to 3D printing it on a Anycubic Photon S. The result is really usable. It's quite a good copy of the original one. I will build it on Thingiverse in case anyone of you will need it. And I have to add, this design is speculative, so there's no reference of the pipe actually installed on a raised air filter. They are mostly covered up, or there are not that many built that way and not many photographs of it, of course. Having to disassemble it anyway, I could just deal with what I neglected in the construction phase, getting rid of some mold seams, then some glue residue, of course, and I drilled then the hole. That's a 2mm hole for a 1.8mm pipe, giving it quite a good tolerance. And after modifying the photo edge grill here to take the pipe, it was time to dry fit the whole thing, test fit it, and it fit quite well. I took the opportunity, since I have to use the airbrush again, to scrape off some of the sprue attachment points I missed in the first place. This was pointed out by you guys and I'm very thankful. I'm always positive about getting my mistakes shown so I can fix them. So I took the opportunity and addressed some other problems here. The weld seam on the casemate front, for example, was a little bit off adjusted. For a general advice, I would like to convey my experience onto you. And for me, it is the experience that going into a scale model and fixing things very late into the build or when it's already finished is no exception, but more the rule. Look, I'm not that experienced to give you guys full-blown tutorials on scale modeling, but yeah, what I would like to give as advice is build with the mindset of going back and fixing things. It's not a big deal, and since I'm building in sections, I have to switch back and forth between weathering products anyways, so I have the opportunity to fix this and that more often than dealing with step by step all over the complete model. Okay, let's make some progress. The whole thing is painted and fixed into place. What is missing are the photo edge leather straps. I have to redo them as well. They are a little bit covered in too much glue and the shape doesn't fit. So I switched to a soft foam and rolled these photo edge strips with a lower diameter drill bit just to get them in a complete round shape. That works very easy and nice, and they are now round enough to snugly fit around the target diameter. With that in place, they are really easy to fit around the air filter and can be attached with some small dots of super glue instead of covering and bending them around. Yeah, I know I'm a little bit stupid in the construction phase, but that will be subject of improvement within the next projects, of course. So this is where I want to leave you guys for this week. I finish the StuG in the next episode. I'm sorry for stretching this over 3 episodes, and still I tried to adopt a few new standards here on YouTube standards I would like to show in detail, so I don't have to chew through it on every build and can focus on different aspects. I hope you guys are fine with this, and if you guys enjoyed watching the video, all my intentions are met. Thank you guys for watching, thanks for subscribing. See you next week. Happy modeling!